In late July of 1999, a 35-year-old woman stepped out of her apartment building in Manhattan, New York, just as the sun was coming up. It had been an especially hot summer, so she'd been going for runs as early as possible to try to beat the heat. She strapped her Walkman to her waistband and settled headphones over her ears as she jogged down the sidewalk toward the park. But when she turned the corner, she came to a sudden stop. Just in front of her, in the middle of the sidewalk, lay something big and black. The woman peered at the motionless object and saw that it was covered with these blue and black feathers. She inched closer and realized it was a huge dead crow. Then she glanced at the sidewalk ahead of her and she gasped. Dead crows were all over the sidewalk. She counted 6 or 7 scattered all down the street. The woman looked around her, trying to find some kind of explanation for what she was seeing, but as she did, another crow right above her suddenly stopped flying and fell to the ground with a thud. Clearly, something in this park was killing these birds, but the woman had no idea what it was. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we'll explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please bring the follow button on their first ever ski trip and tell them you'll start them out really easy, but as soon as you get to the mountain, immediately bring them up to a double black diamond slope, wave, and ride away. This episode is called The Birds. 60-year-old Douglas Wise knelt down inside of his garden, pulling weeds out of the small vegetable patch behind his townhouse in Queens, New York. It was August 1999, and just like every other day that summer, it was hot and muggy. Doug's shirt stuck to his back as he worked. After he finished pulling up all the weeds, he sprayed the soil with some weed killer. He paused for a moment to admire the fat tomatoes ripening on the vines he'd planted that spring. He intended to use every one of them in homemade marinara sauce. When his garden was looking neat and trim, Doug gathered the weeds into a garbage bag and then took them to the compost bin inside of his garage. Doug tried not to gag as he opened the lid. On hot days like this, the bin could smell absolutely disgusting. He dumped the weeds onto the decaying pile of eggshells and table scraps. Then, to help the composting process along, he took a bucket of rainwater he'd collected the week before and poured a little into the bin. He smiled to himself, knowing how his wife Carmen quietly hated that he collected rainwater in large buckets, but it had actually come in handy earlier in the summer when they'd gone more than a month without rain. Doug had enough water for composting and a little extra for his garden, all while being able to conserve tap water. Doug closed the bin and then grabbed a beer from the garage refrigerator and sat in a folding chair on the porch near the sidewalk. After a few hours in his garden, Doug liked to have a drink and people watch. It was his idea of a perfect Sunday afternoon. When Doug finished the last of his beer, he tossed the can into a recycling bin and headed inside for a shower. He was careful not to touch anything on his way to the bathroom. Carmen had just cleaned the house from top to bottom, and she'd kill him if she saw dirt smudges on anything. After Doug rinsed off and had some dinner, he joined his wife in the living room to watch some TV. But as he sat there, he started to feel a headache come on, and so he began rubbing his temples, and he wondered if maybe staring at the screen and straining his eyes was causing this headache. So he asked his wife to turn off the TV. But even after she did, over the next few minutes, his headache only got worse. Doug finally went to the kitchen and took some aspirin. And while that did help his head feel a bit better, his stomach now started to feel queasy. And so Doug told his wife that he just didn't feel right, and so he was going to go to bed early. He wasn't sure if maybe he ate something bad or if he was actually getting sick, like with the flu. Carmen agreed that he should just go to bed because after all, he'd spent the whole day in the yard under the beating sun. Doug kissed his wife goodnight and headed upstairs, hoping to feel better in the morning. But the next morning, when his alarm went off at 7 a.m., he was groggy and still had a headache, and his stomach still churned. Next to him, his wife had sat up, and she turned to him and said, you better get up if you don't want to be late for work. But Doug asked her to grab the phone for him because he felt absolutely terrible and he needed to call in sick. 3 days later, Carmen ladled some chicken noodle soup into a bowl, then placed it on a tray alongside a glass of ginger ale and some saltine crackers. Carefully, she carried it all up the stairs to the bedroom. Doug was in the bedroom, in bed, propped up on pillows. After 3 days of feeling totally sick, he'd lost a lot of fluids and looked very pale. As she set the tray onto the bedside table, she told her husband that she'd also bring him up a Gatorade. Carmen frowned as Doug nodded feebly. Her husband had been sick only a handful of times over the years, and when he was, it was rarely for more than 24 hours, and he had never been this weak and pale. Whatever bug her husband had caught, it had knocked him flat out. Carmen left the bedroom and headed downstairs to get the Gatorade from the fridge, and then when she had it, she went back up the stairs, and when she went back into the bedroom, she was surprised to see that Doug was not eating his soup. She asked if he was hungry, and Doug said that he was, but he said his hands were not steady enough to hold the bowl. Then he asked for Carmen's help walking to the bathroom. He said he was just too weak to get up on his own. Now Carmen was truly concerned. As she helped her husband to his feet and led him to the bathroom, she did her best to conceal her worry. Once Doug came out of the bathroom and was tucked back into his bed, Carmen asked him if he'd like her to feed him some soup. But Doug didn't respond. Instead, he just kind of stared out the window like he didn't even hear her. For several moments, Carmen spoke Doug's name with increasing urgency, but he just continued his glassy stare, saying nothing. Carmen was now terrified. She thought maybe Doug was having a stroke, so she grabbed the phone and called 911. It took a few minutes for an ambulance to arrive. While they waited, Carmen sat on the edge of the bed as Doug seemed to slip in and out of a trance, at times barely registering what was happening around him. By the time the paramedics arrived and moved Doug onto a stretcher, he was barely conscious. Carmen followed the paramedics downstairs and then out to the ambulance waiting in the driveway. She prayed silently as 2 EMTs hoisted up Doug's stretcher and secured it in the back of the ambulance. Then one of the men turned around and offered Carmen a hand, helping her into the back of the ambulance as well. Carmen took a seat on the bench, keeping one hand on her husband. As they sped towards the hospital, for the first time in her life, Carmen worried about losing her husband. Once the ambulance arrived at Flushing Hospital, Doug was rushed into the emergency room while a nurse brought Carmen to the waiting area. After about a half hour, a doctor wearing scrubs and a lab coat approached Carmen and brought her to Doug's room. Doug was lying in bed, still looking a bit out of it, with an IV hooked up to his arm. Carmen rushed over to him and kissed his forehead. The doctor told Carmen that he was fairly positive Doug had pneumonia, and if everything went well, he'd be back to normal in just a few days. Carmen squeezed Doug's shoulder, relieved to hear that he'd be okay. Later that same afternoon, the infectious disease specialist at Flushing Hospital, Dr. Debbie Asnes, was pouring herself a cup of coffee in the staff break room when her pager beeped. She checked the message and saw there was an emergency downstairs and she was needed right away. Dr. Asnes raised her eyebrows. It was unusual for the infectious disease specialist to be paged to the emergency room. If she was being called, it had to be a very unusual case that required outside-of-the-box thinking. And Dr. Asnes loved a challenge. Throughout her nearly 20 years as a doctor, she'd always been drawn to puzzling cases. She'd spent a lot of her career researching HIV, and she'd witnessed firsthand how bad things could get when doctors did not understand how a disease worked. So without a second thought, she set her coffee down, headed out of the break room, and ran to the elevator. The moment the elevator doors opened back up on the ER floor, she could hear a man's voice carrying down the hallway. He was yelling about some strange woman standing near his bed. As Dr. Asnes approached, the ER doctor who had paged her popped his head out of the man's room and waved her in. The patient who was yelling was Doug. For the first few hours he'd spent in the ER, he'd mostly just slept, but he'd woken up in a sudden panic, and now he was yelling incoherently at the people all around him. At the same time, Carmen, his wife, was standing by his side, trying to remind him who she was. As Dr. Asnes watched this, she immediately noticed something strange. Despite being agitated, Doug's arms and legs remained still and limp on the hospital bed. The ER doctor explained to Dr. Asnes that Doug was being treated for pneumonia, but the medical team was starting to think that that was not the right diagnosis. 10 minutes ago, Doug woke up confused and agitated and didn't recognize his wife. He started flailing his arms and the nurse ran in to restrain him, but then his arms and legs just went limp, and he'd not been able to move them since. Now Dr. Asnes understood why she had been called. pneumonia does not make people paralyzed. Doug's symptoms were far more likely to have been caused by an infectious disease, and that was Dr. Asness's area of expertise. And Dr. Asness was very thankful the ER staff paged her so quickly because she now suspected that Doug's confusion was likely being caused by swelling in his brain, which is very, very dangerous. Just then, Doug suddenly went silent. Dr. Asness bent over the bed and realized he was gasping for air. Dr. Asness said that Doug needed to be moved to the intensive care unit in case his breathing got even worse. The ER doctor agreed and told the nurse to get Doug ready to move. Within minutes, the nurse and the ER doctor each grabbed a side of Doug's hospital bed and wheeled it out of the room. As she followed Doug, Dr. Asness turned to Carmen and asked her to stay behind until they stabilized her husband. Then, as Doug was wheeled down the hallway, Dr. Asness grabbed onto his bed to help steer him to the elevator. She was already thinking about which tests Doug would need. A few hours later, Dr. Asness stood in her office reviewing Doug's charts. She had ordered a test of Doug's spinal fluid because to her, something was clearly wrong with his nervous system. But she was puzzled by the results she was looking at. The test found clear evidence of a brain infection called viral encephalitis, but Dr. Asness was not sure that was correct. Although many of Doug's symptoms were consistent with viral encephalitis, it wouldn't explain his sudden muscle weakness. And Doug's breathing problems were more severe than the doctor normally saw in a case of viral encephalitis. Before Dr. Asness could think any further, her pager sounded, and when she looked at it, she saw she was needed again in the emergency room. So Dr. Asness ran back to the elevator, she took it down to the main floor of the hospital, and then she began running down the hallway towards the ER. But when she was only about halfway down the hallway, a colleague came out of the ER and ran right up to her and began telling her about the emergency that she was being called to. A man named Harold Marsh had been rushed in from his home in Queens, which was not far from Doug's home, after suffering a massive heart attack. But it wasn't the heart attack they wanted to talk to her about. They were afraid the heart attack was only part of this man's problems. The colleague from the ER explained to Dr. Asness that like the first patient, Doug Wise, Harold, the second patient here, was older but active and healthy. His family reported that he had suddenly developed muscle weakness, flu symptoms, and worst of all, a staggeringly high 105-degree fever. Dr. Asness felt a knot growing in her chest. Fevers that high were practically unheard of in heart attack patients. Dr. Asness thanked her colleague and then just ordered Harold to be moved immediately to the ICU. Her mind was racing as she began to connect the dots. Two men living only blocks apart had both come down with the same mysterious symptoms in less than a week. This could be the beginning of an outbreak. For the moment, Harold was stable, so Dr. Asness hurried back to her office to have some time to think. But as soon as she arrived on the 4th floor where her office was, she saw a nurse sprinting into Doug Wise's room. So Dr. Asness ran down the hallway and went into Doug's room as well, just in time to see a colleague shove a breathing tube down Doug's throat and hook him up to a ventilator. The colleague, who was an ICU doctor, then explained to Dr. Asness that Doug's muscle weakness was now so severe that his lungs had basically stopped working. Dr. Asness was thankful her colleague had acted so quickly, but she was afraid this was only the first case of something much bigger. And if others out in the streets were contracting this virus, the consequences could be catastrophic. Dr. Asness turned on her heel and rushed toward her office. She needed to alert the New York Health Department right away. Five days later, on August 27th, a medical investigator at the New York Department of Health hung up the phone in her office, wishing she'd never answered it in the first place. Her name was Annie Fine, and after a long week of work, she was ready to go home. She was knee-deep in planning her wedding, and she and her fiancé had wanted to knock out as many to-do items as possible over the weekend, but instead it looked like she would spend her weekend at Flushing Hospital. A doctor there had called in a potential outbreak on Monday, and after several days of discussions and 3 more patients in the hospital with identical symptoms, her boss had finally decided it was worth investigating. Dr. Fine reminded herself that, in all fairness, she was the on-call epidemiologist that weekend. That meant she would be responsible for any emergency that came up. But in addition, her boss and good friend, Dr. Marcy Layton, had asked her personally to help out, and she was always game to help Dr. Layton. So on Saturday morning, Dr. Fine woke up a minute before her alarm clock began screeching. She managed to turn it off before it had the chance to wake her fiancé, and then she quietly got out of bed. Half an hour later, she headed down the stairs of her apartment building and saw Dr. Layton's car parked outside. She smiled as she jumped into the passenger seat, and Dr. Layton laughed and apologized for interrupting her weekend plans. Then Dr. Layton handed Dr. Fine a cup of to-go coffee, and they peeled off toward Flushing Hospital. After a short drive, Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton parked near the hospital and climbed out of the car. As soon as Dr. Layton had stepped onto the curb, she made a disgusted noise, and Dr. Fine turned to look at what she was disgusted at, and she saw there was a dead crow lying in the gutter right near Dr. Layton's feet. Both doctors had been seeing dead crows all over New York that entire summer. So they both just walked around the dead bird, and the two women headed for the hospital. Right outside the ICU, the two doctors were greeted by a tall, thin man wearing a lab coat. He told Dr. Fine that he was the chief resident, which meant he was a doctor in training, standing in for Dr. Asness, who was out of town on a family emergency. He explained that in the 5 days since Dr. Asness first called the Department of Health about her first two patients, 3 more people had been admitted to Flushing Hospital with symptoms of viral encephalitis. All 5 were older people who were previously healthy and active. Most worrisome, all 5 also had other symptoms not normally caused by viral encephalitis, including fever, stomach pain, confusion, muscle weakness, and severe difficulty breathing. The chief resident added that all 5 patients had declined really quickly. 4 were now on ventilators, and the 5th was not, but they were delirious with pain. Dr. Fine felt unnerved. All of a sudden, wedding planning was the last thing on her mind. There were usually only about 10 viral encephalitis cases every year in all of New York City. But now, one small neighborhood in New York City had 5 cases in less than a week, and so far, nobody had figured out why. Dr. Fine asked the resident to go collect blood samples from each of these patients and submit them for additional testing. In the meantime, she and Dr. Layton would interview the patients' families and anyone else who was with these people in the week leading up to their hospitalization. The resident nodded and then led Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton to an empty conference room where they could call people and interview them. Dr. Layton would ask the questions and Dr. Fine would take notes. By that afternoon, Dr. Fine's writing hand was totally cramped. She spent hours taking notes as she and Dr. Layton spoke with the patient's family members. Outside, it was starting to get dark, so Dr. Fine rolled her chair toward the wall and switched on the overhead lights. The conference room table was littered with textbooks, stacks of medical journals, and reports on annual encephalitis cases in New York. Dr. Fine looked over at Dr. Layton and sighed. Despite hours of interviews and poring over the patients' files, they still did not know how these 5 patients in Flushing Hospital had contracted encephalitis. But they had found that all 5 patients had 2 things in common. First, that they all lived within a few square miles from one another in Queens, and second, they all loved to spend time outdoors in the evenings. A few of the patients, like Doug Wise, the first patient, would work in their gardens until nightfall. Others just liked to watch the sunset from their back decks or take long walks along the East River after dinner. Dr. Fine looked out the window as the street lamps flickered to life, and right as they did, it hit her. People were not the only ones who loved summer evenings. It's also the time when mosquitoes are at their most active. All 5 of their encephalitis patients were probably swatting away mosquitoes as they gardened or walked or gazed at the sunset in the gathering darkness each night. And Dr. Fine knew something else about mosquitoes. They spread disease. Diseases like encephalitis, a condition that often strikes older people like Doug and Harold more frequently. Dr. Layton was intrigued by Dr. Fine's idea, but she was cautious. If mosquitoes really were spreading some new virus to people, they should be able to find mosquitoes infected with the disease. And so until they were able to isolate the virus in mosquitoes, then Dr. Fine's idea was really just a theory. Before the doctors left the hospital that night, Dr. Fine wrote up an alert that Dr. Layton sent to all the neighboring hospitals, asking them to report any cases of viral encephalitis to the Department of Health. That way, she and Dr. Layton would know if the virus was spreading. 2 days later, on the morning of September 1st, Dr. Fine sat at her desk, twisting her pencil in her hands. She was back in her office, feeling frustrated by the lab results she had just read. That morning, she and Dr. Layton had sent a small team to northern Queens, where all these patients had lived, and the job of this team was to canvass that neighborhood and visit the houses of each encephalitis patient and try to find breeding mosquitoes. Well, that team collected several samples of mosquito larvae from standing water around the neighborhood, but none of those mosquitoes were infected with viral encephalitis. Meanwhile, Dr. Fine was still waiting for lab work to come back on the blood samples she'd collected from the 5 infected patients. While Dr. Fine thought about what she should do next, Dr. Layton knocked on her door. She said she had bad news. One of the encephalitis patients, Harold Marsh, had grown so weak that the doctors determined he would not recover. Moments ago, the family had decided to take him off life support. Dr. Fine's heart broke for Harold and his family. She was frustrated that she couldn't even tell them for certain what had killed their loved one. It felt like they were back at square one. But, at the very least, Dr. Fine knew that the doctors at Flushing Hospital would be able to do an autopsy and take tissue samples they couldn't get while Harold was alive. Dr. Fine hoped that these samples could help them identify the virus and warn the public at large. The following morning, Dr. Fine walked into her office to find her boss, Dr. Layton, waiting for her with news about Harold Marsh's autopsy tissue samples. Tests indicated that Harold had died of something called St. Louis encephalitis, a very rare strain of the disease that's only spread by mosquitoes. Dr. Layton said that federal health officials had also checked the blood samples from the other 4 encephalitis patients in Queens, and they found that they too had tested positive for St. Louis encephalitis. All 5 of the patients had gotten sick from mosquito bites. Dr. Fine frowned. On the one hand, it was nice to know that her theory that mosquitoes could have caused this was in fact what caused this, but this diagnosis didn't really make sense. The patient's symptoms were all consistent with St. Louis encephalitis, but there had never been a reported case of St. Louis encephalitis in New York City until now. In fact, there were only about 30 reported cases a year in the entire United States, and these were almost exclusively in southern swamplands. Dr. Fine wondered if infected mosquitoes had somehow migrated north, but if they had, there would have been cases of it in other places along the eastern seaboard, and so far, the only cases of it were from this outbreak in Queens. Something just didn't add up. Dr. Fine told Dr. Layton that she was glad they finally knew what was going on, but deep down, she still could not shake the feeling that there was something off about this diagnosis. A few weeks later, Dr. Fine was in her office at the Department of Health when Dr. Layton knocked on the door. When she came in, she had a very serious expression on her face. Dr. Layton explained that she'd just gotten off the phone with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and Dr. Fine's suspicions were correct. The virus they were investigating was not actually St. Louis encephalitis. It was much worse. A pathologist at the Bronx Zoo, of all places, had figured out the mistake. She'd been trying to understand why all these birds were dying all over the city, and she had discovered that they were actually contracting some form of encephalitis. And then after she learned about the St. Louis encephalitis outbreak in the city, she began to investigate whether that was what was killing all these birds. But tissue samples from the dead birds showed no sign of St. Louis encephalitis. Instead, the birds had a different strain that can easily be confused with the St. Louis strain, but it's actually much more dangerous. And the birds were loaded with this different strain. In fact, the birds got this strain of encephalitis at such a high concentration that a mosquito sucking their blood could pass on the disease to the next creature it bites, including humans. And sure enough, when the CDC retested the blood of the patients at Flushing Hospital, they found that they too had the same strain of encephalitis as the birds. This strain is known as West Nile virus. West Nile is something that likely lots of people have heard of, but it's actually even more rare than the St. Louis strain, at least in the United States, because until this point, it had never been seen in the United States. It was only really seen in Africa. the CDC suspected that an infected mosquito from some other part of the world had found its way onto a plane maybe, and then come to the US that way, or maybe a sick bird had gotten onto a boat, and that's how the disease came to the United States. But now that this disease had crossed the ocean and arrived in the US, Dr. Fine knew it was here to stay. By the time the CDC put the puzzle together, as many as 1,900 residents of northern Queens were infected with West Nile virus. 62 people landed in the hospital, and 7 people died that summer in 1999 before the mosquitoes disappeared with the fall. And in the years since those initial cases, over 56,000 people have been infected in the United States. 2,776 have died as of 2022. Although the mortality rate of St. Louis encephalitis and West Nile is comparable, West Nile is far more dangerous. Because it can be carried by birds, West Nile has spread to all 50 states, while St. Louis encephalitis remains fairly localized and far less common. Doug Wise, the first patient to come in with West Nile, remained in Flushing Hospital for several weeks before he was healthy enough to transfer to a physical rehabilitation facility where he stayed for the next month. By spring of 2000, Doug was able to walk with the assistance of a special cane, but his left side never regained its former strength, and he continued to suffer episodes of short-term memory loss. But ultimately, Doug knew he was one of the lucky ones from that painful summer of 1999. He could at least still tend to his garden as long as he wore his mosquito repellent. On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him, and as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything, and he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that, but a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down. Is she okay?" And at first, Richard was like, wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall? But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, you snubbed me in the lunch line. And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning, during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up. And Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met, there's no connection whatsoever, they just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird," well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. Our next story is called Lucky Shot. There is a very popular TV show on HBO called Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it's about the mega famous Larry David who created Seinfeld. And so Curb Your Enthusiasm is totally a satire. It's a comedy, it's about Larry David. And in fact, Larry David plays himself in the show, but Larry David in the show is a very exaggerated version of himself in real life. But the show is shot to look like it's almost biographical, but it's not. It's totally comedy. Apparently, in real life, Larry is known for getting into kind of funny, awkward situations, often that he brings on himself. And so on the show, basically every episode, Larry David finds himself getting into totally absurd situations that just get worse and worse and worse because Larry just makes all the wrong decisions. And so it's a really funny show. However, there is one particular episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm that will go down as the single episode virtually everyone who has ever watched the show will remember, and it's not because it was funny. It's because this particular episode had massive ripple effects that nobody from Larry David to writers to producers, anybody involved with this production could have predicted. The episode in question is called The Carpool Lane, and in this episode, Larry David, the character, is late to a baseball game at Dodger Stadium. And so he's stuck in traffic and he's totally upset. And then he has this idea that if he picks up the sex worker who's right outside his car, that if she gets in the car with him, he'll now have 2 passengers in his car and therefore will be eligible to use the carpool lane that currently nobody else was using in this traffic jam. And so that would allow him to get to Dodger Stadium faster. And so he hires this sex worker and she gets in the car and Larry kind of awkwardly explains his plan. And then he hops in the carpool lane. He makes his way to Dodger Stadium. The plan works great. And when he gets there, he actually ends up bringing the sex worker with him into the stadium just to enjoy the game with him. And so he goes up, they find their seats, and their seats are just so bad. But as they're sitting there and Larry's totally upset about how bad his seats are, Larry happens to see one of his friends who's also at this Dodgers game, and Larry can tell, his friend has great seats. And so the rest of the episode is basically Larry going down and trying to convince his friend to give up his seats for Larry and his sex worker to watch the game, and his friend just continuously says no. And so really that's the gist of the episode, and you can see how it kind of gets more and more ridiculous, and it gets really funny, but it's pretty typical writing for this show. This was not like a special show in any way. It was just kind of par for the course Curb Your Enthusiasm. That is, until a lawyer named Todd Melnick heard about it. In the fall of 2003, this lawyer, Todd Melnick, called HBO and said he needed to see the raw footage from the episode they shot called A Carpool Lane. A producer at HBO named Tim Gibbons is the one who answered this call, and his first reaction was, we can't let you see this footage because this episode hasn't even aired yet, and so you're going to have to wait the couple of months until this episode comes out if you want to see this footage. But Tim quickly noticed that Todd Melnick, the lawyer, was not about to give up this easily. He was adamant that he had to see this footage right now. And so eventually, Tim Gibbons actually would go and find Larry David, and he would ask Larry, hey, do you mind if this random lawyer comes and watches this footage from this unaired episode? And Larry was like, okay. And so the next day, Todd Melnick showed up at HBO, and he was led into this small room with a TV, and Tim, the producer he spoke to, as well as Larry David and a few other people from the Curb Your Enthusiasm production, they all filed into this room, and all of them just sat down, and then they began playing the footage, the raw footage from the Carpool Lane episode. And as they watched this footage, which was hours and hours and hours long, the lawyer, Todd Melnick, is watching the footage and just kind of slumping into his chair, just seeming like what he was watching was making him more and more unhappy. That clearly, he was looking for something and he was not seeing it in this footage. But finally, when one of the producers put in the 5th and final tape of raw footage from this episode, Todd Melnick, as he's sitting there watching the footage, which looks basically like Larry walking up and down the steps at Dodger Stadium over and over again, and him also walking in and out of his aisle, they reshot the scene of him sitting down inside of his crappy seats. Todd's watching this over and over again, and then suddenly he sits up and he points at the screen and goes, "Right there." It would turn out Todd Melnick was investigating a murder case. The murder happened on May 12, 2003. A 16-year-old girl named Martha Puebla was standing in front of her house in a neighborhood in Los Angeles when she was shot by gang members because apparently a rumor had gotten out that Martha was snitching on gang members, and so she was killed. And the police actually had already made an arrest in this murder. They had arrested a guy named Juan Catalan. Juan's brother, Mario, was on trial for a different murder, and just 2 weeks before Martha's murder, Martha testified in Mario's case. And who was in the audience listening to Martha's damning testimony about Mario? Well, Mario's brother, Juan. And so prosecutors believed this was the motive for Juan to kill Martha. Also, there was an eyewitness to Martha's murder, and the sketch artist who worked with this eyewitness came up with a composite sketch of Martha's killer that looked exactly like Juan. And so now Juan was potentially facing the death penalty if he was found guilty. But Juan was adamant that he did not kill Martha, and on the night of her murder, he said he was at the Dodgers game where they were filming a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. But nobody believed him except for his lawyer, Todd Melnick, who called HBO, got access to all that unseen footage from the episode, and after watching for hours and hours and hours, finally that 5th tape goes in, and sure enough, Todd Melnick watched as his client, Juan Catalan, strolled right into frame and sat down with his daughter. It would turn out Juan was telling the truth the whole time, he did not kill Martha, and Curb Your Enthusiasm proved it. Shortly after this discovery, Juan would be released from prison and he would receive a settlement of $320,000 from the city of Los Angeles and the police. As for Martha, the police were able to eventually track down 4 people who were involved in her murder, and all 4 would be convicted and sent to jail for life. The next and final story of today's episode is called Familiar Face. On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Mishe Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Mishe knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Mishe, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress, and thanked her mom for all the hard work, and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Mishe, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast, she finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye, and then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious, and so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us. A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt, she thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile and then quickly looked away from Misha. And then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared. And she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time, they shared everything with each other, and certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already 2 people inside who she didn't recognize. It was 2 women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the 2 women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the 2 women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these 2 women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them. You can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the 2 women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office. And they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug, and it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house, and Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things and looked so dramatically similar is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, LaVonna Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that LaVonna's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, LaVonna had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and LaVonna did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany. When in reality, after LaVonna had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that LaVonna had stitched for her to her high school dance well after the news came out about who LaVonna was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is